Canadian officials are in Washington today to talk trade with their American counterparts. This visit coming ahead of a key deadline, of course, that could fundamentally alter the already fragile commercial relationship between our country and the United States. So Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc seen arriving at the U.S. Trade Representative headquarters earlier today. The new 50% tariffs threatened by the White House are due to come into effect next Wednesday. They would cover a swath of Canadian goods, including some that were previously tariff-free under the terms of CUSMA. But at this point, Ottawa has remained tight-lipped about what, if any, progress has been made on a potential deal to stop those punishing levies from coming into effect, and that is very soon. Mackenzie Gray joins us from Ottawa. He's been following this with the latest. All right, Mackenzie, always a pleasure. What do we know so far? Because we have not heard too much about the negotiations. Where do they stand?
No, we haven't. The meeting with Dominic LeBlanc and Jamieson Greer, the two key players on either side, has wrapped up. It was only about an hour long. Mr. LeBlanc and Mr. Greer have not met on many occasions. It's really been three kind of key in-person meetings over the past few months. Mr. LeBlanc contends, when we've asked him about that he's consistently texting, that they've had virtual meetings, so that there have been other conversations. So let's see how things play out. We'll work our sources certainly after the meeting today to see what kind of progress has been made. When we were talking with our sources yesterday, there was a couple kind of key things from both the American side and the Canadian side in terms of how these negotiations are going to go. On the American side, one thing that is not going to happen in this situation from the folks that we've talked with is that the U.S. is not going to give a tariff-free deal to Canada. That's what Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have called on. The expectation is that if there's going to be some kind of agreement to reduce tariffs, that there are going to be tariffs on things like autos, softwood, steel, aluminum. Those are really the key four sectors that are being focused in on this time, particularly from a Canadian perspective. If Canada is going to agree to a deal, there's going to be needing a substantial reduction from the 50% level that most of those tariffs are at right now. Those are going to need to come down by a fair bit. We've heard from U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, before previously saying that what Canada could hope for in this situation is the lowest possible tariff bucket. That's 10%. That's what the UK has right now. I don't know if it'll get that low, particularly on steel and aluminum, but if there is going to be a deal, there needs to be a major drop on those 50% levels. What kind of concessions is Canada willing to make in this situation? Well, those details are certainly fluid at this point in time. We do, though, know what the Americans are really upset about. Dairy is a key thing in this situation. That's something that Quebec's premier brought up yesterday in the context of another key irritant that the Americans have, which is alcohol. Most of the provinces have taken U.S. alcohol off provincial shelves. Quebec's premier said yesterday that she'd be willing to put that back on if there was help for the forestry sector in Quebec and in manufacturing, as well as no changes to dairy quotas. So very complicated negotiations that are going on right now. And you mentioned in the intro, August 19th is the deadline. So if there's going to be a deal, things are going to need to get to Donald Trump relatively soon, because Dominic LeBlanc and Jamieson Greer can talk all day, but we've heard from the Americans, and we've really seen in practice with a number of other deals, most recently this Saudi nuclear deal, that these things need to go to Trump. And even when they get to Trump and he's on side with things, he often changes the terms or new things get added at the last second. So I think a long way to go in this situation before a deal is actually signed and finalized. And that deadline is kind of bumping things up. Only a few more days left before the 19th.
Okay, as we know and as you've highlighted, the goalposts keep changing, so we never quite know if it's going to take effect, even if there is a threat. Let's talk about the economic impact, because it's already been pretty fierce for a lot of industries across this country. With all the tariffs that do exist, this would be added on top of many others. What are we looking at?
Well, let's start with kind of the negative aspects associated with it. It's $28 billion. A lot of the tariffs are focused on the auto sector. Some go after alcohol, some go after dairy. These are clearly targeted by the Americans to hit sectors that they feel that Canada's been hitting on, of course. We've just outlined some of those, with booze in particular not being in the provincial liquor stores. It's not as big as some of the tariffs that we've seen before on steel and aluminum. And when you break it down, one of the numbers that economists use, the Bank of Canada in particular goes after, is the effective tariff rate. What does it mean for the economy overarchingly in terms of what the tariff level is across the board? Because, of course, there's going to be over 80% of goods that go between Canada and the U.S. that are still going to be tariff-free, even if these new tariffs come in. Before the tariffs, so where we are right now with the steel, aluminum tariffs, other tariffs the Americans have on, it's about 5.5%. That's the effective tariff rate if you spread these tariffs across the entire economy. It would go up to around 6.5% to 7% based on some of the analysis that we've looked at. So definitely an increase, but still not as high as we see tariffs in some other countries. But we have to break that down on a sector by sector basis. The Americans are targeting things that they want to have more production in the U.S. Steel and aluminum, of course, being a big thing. Autos, how many times have we heard the president say, we don't need cars that are made in Canada? But the impact, while it is mainly sector specific, we've heard from the Bank of Canada that there hasn't been contagion, that those issues have not spread across the Canadian economy. There are major differences from a regional perspective. RBC has broken down how the current tariffs and the new tariffs would impact on a province by province basis. BC would have the biggest hit, it'd be around 12%. Quebec and Ontario, they'd be around 10% there. But if you go out west in terms of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're in the 1% range. So the Americans have certainly tailored these tariffs that could come into place towards provinces that I certainly think have been more aggressive towards them and maybe more favorable towards provinces in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the two provinces that don't have bans on provincial alcohol sales of American liquor in those liquor stores, maybe a bit more favorable there. Of course, they don't want to tariff energy, potash, things that the Americans really do need in this situation. So it'll be interesting to see the provincial dynamics at play, in particular if the Prime Minister is going to go to the premiers and say, hey, I can get you a deal. Maybe I can get steel and aluminum tariffs down to 20 or 15%, but you got to put booze back on the shelf. What are those provinces willing to do in those situations and work with the federal government to get that done? So while there are those negotiations today between Mr. Greer and Mr. LeBlanc, there's a lot of other things, not just with Donald Trump, but also with the provinces that need to be agreed to actually have a deal come into force.
The next week will be interesting, perhaps a little tense, complex conversation. We appreciate you breaking it down for us, Mackenzie. Thank you.
Always great to see you.
That is Mackenzie Gray joining us from Ottawa.